So Doom: The Dark Ages has released, and today we're going to be trying the game at 4K, all the settings on a 7900 XTX. So the first thing we're going to be doing is 4K max settings. I did turn some settings off like motion blur and film grain, but obviously that doesn't really affect performance, so it really doesn't matter if you have them on or off. It's more of a personal preference. But we're going with ultra nightmare settings at 4K, and let's just see how it runs. So to be honest, right away, I was kind of shocked with how bad this game was running. It was pretty much staying in the 40 frames per second right away, and I honestly thought it was going to run way better just because the previous Doom games are just so well optimized and just run just really well on pretty much everything. And then I remembered that this game has forced ray tracing. The game was built around ray tracing, so you can't turn it off. So no matter what you play on, the game will always have ray tracing. And I also think that's why we're going to see some of the results that we're seeing later where we can turn down settings, but it doesn't actually affect the frame rate all that much. And then they're going to add path tracing apparently later, which, makes games run even worse. And obviously that is going to be optional, which is good. I mean, I'm pretty sure Indiana Jones has like forced path tracing. I have no idea why. Path tracing, the thing that even the 5090 can struggle to run games at max settings with path tracing on. Either way, with ultra nightmare settings at 4K with the 7900 XTX, the game runs at about 41 frames per second on average. The next settings we're going to be looking at, of course, is just going down one step and turning everything to nightmare. I don't know why I didn't just click the overall quality slider to nightmare, but I did everything separately. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but I don't know why I did that. I'm not really sure exactly what I expected, maybe a few more frames, but the average was exactly the same. At the end of my run that I did, and I did the same run for every setting, so it was the exact same for every settings that I tested, but it got 41 frames per second on average by the end of the run, which means the frame rate didn't really change. You're not really going to notice a frame rate difference from Ultra Nightmare to just Nightmare. Though honestly, I think that was kind of expected, since usually the highest settings and the second highest settings don't really have much of a difference. So I lowered the settings to Ultra, and this is where I thought maybe, just maybe, we could get closer to 60 frames per second on average. I was immediately proven wrong when I thought the frame rate would be at least slightly different, when the average frame rate went to 42 frames per second instead of 41. There's hardly a frame rate difference from Ultra Nightmare to Ultra. I mean, there's almost, if I didn't have the frame rate counter on, you probably would never notice a frame rate difference when you're just playing the game. It is so little. And yes, I did think something was not right and maybe broken, so I decided to restart it, and nope, the frame rate did not change. So Ultra Nightmare, Nightmare, and Ultra are basically, they perform basically the same, at least on the 7900 XTX. So I lowered the settings to high, and honestly at this point, I didn't really have high hopes. And at this point, I honestly wasn't even shocked at this point, but the frame rate didn't really move. I mean, we got a little bit more FPS, and sometimes we got close to the 50s, but honestly, it didn't really move, and the average frame rates just went up to around 43 frames per second on average. So, just to be clear here, Ultra Nightmare was 41 frames per second, Nightmare was around 41 frames per second, and Ultra was like 42 frames per second, and then High is 43 frames per second. I mean, you're slowly moving up in frames here, and I think honestly why the game isn't really changing frame rate wise is because of the ray tracing. I think the ray tracing is just what's causing the performance to just tank so much, and the settings not really make a difference. And also, yes, I did play the game for longer than you're seeing it, but I like to show the same area so you can compare the same thing. But I always did the same run. I did basically most of this mission per each run that I did with the settings. And I'm just guessing at this point, but I honestly believe that if this game didn't have forced ray tracing, or at least wasn't built around ray tracing to where you had to use it, it was only an option, this game would run so much better. In fact, I think we would be up near 120 frames per second on Ultra Nightmare settings with the 7900 XTX if ray tracing wasn't mandatory. So I lowered the settings to medium, and I hope that maybe, just maybe at medium settings at 4K, we could just maybe get 55 frames to 60 frames per second on average. I mean, is that too hopeful at this point? But of course, that was definitely too hopeful because we didn't even break into the 50s. In fact, we mostly stayed from 40 to 45 frames per second once again, and our average frame rate ended up being around 45 frames per second on average. So honestly, it hardly moved, and we're not really getting a big performance difference from medium to ultra nightmare settings. I mean, at this point, you might as well stay on ultra nightmare and just enable some upscalers or frame generation or something, because lowering the settings isn't really going to get you any more frames. So at this point, I lowered the game to low settings at 4K, and just maybe we could get 50 frames per second. I mean, is that possible, game? That's what I was asking when I switched it to low settings. And to my surprise, we actually did manage to get in the 50 frames per second on average. Even we got around 50 frames per second on average, and sometimes we would even get close to 60, but it still dropped into the 40s, and it was kind of still all over the place, and we were definitely not even close to getting 60 frames per second on average. Well, I guess you could count like 50 as close or closer than 41, but we're not hitting 60 frames per second, which means that we cannot play this game at 4K no matter if we lower the settings and get 60 frames per second on a 7900 XTX without some sort of upscaling or frame generation. So let's get into the upscaling and frame generation, because lowering settings doesn't really do anything. So we're going to go back to Ultra Nightmare settings, because if you're going to use upscaling and frame generation, you might as well keep it at the highest settings, because it really isn't going to affect your frame rate that much. So that's exactly what I did. I changed the settings back to Ultra Nightmare, and I just enabled FSR on quality, and just wanted to see if we could get 60 frames per second on average. And the answer is yes, we can finally achieve 60 frames per second on average, and we can even stay in the 70s quite a lot with FSR on quality. So we jumped up to 41 frames per second on average, up into the 60s to 70s, which is pretty good actually. Now, I mean, you do have to use upscaling to get 60 frames per second with a 7900 XTX at 4K, so I don't know if it's that impressive, but I mean, it's pretty playable at least. At least you can have a good time. I mean, the game's fun. I like the game, but I'm kind of disappointed with its performance, to be honest. So next, I turn on frame generation, and this is kind of where I started to run into issues. Not exactly with frame generation. I don't know what was going on, but I could not use MSI Afterburner. It just would not work, no matter if I turned that compute setting on where it says sometimes if you have issues with overlays, turn this off and it might help that, but nothing worked. The game always just froze. It didn't even crash. I could still hear it and everything, but it would not display anything, and I just couldn't play it. And no, I tried not even testing it, just like, or running the benchmark, just having it overlay the frame rate, but that still didn't work, and it just always froze on me. But without MSI Afterburner, it did work, and I can't show you the frame rate because it just would not record because I couldn't use MSI Afterburner. So I used AMD's benchmarking thing, but it wouldn't record it for some reason on the screen. So, but with Ultra Nightmare settings, FSR set to quality, and frame generation on, we got around 120 frames per second on average. So that was quite nice. It was very playable and smooth for the most part, but sometimes it would seem like it was sluggish. Like the frame rate didn't really drop or anything below 60, but sometimes it just felt really bad in certain areas. I don't know if that's because of frame gen, or there's some other bug in this game. I know frame gen is kind of broken in this game apparently, so that might be something. I'm not entirely sure, but it ran smooth for the most part. So that's definitely the way that I I would say either play this game with frame generation and FSR quality on Ultra Nightmare, or Ultra Nightmare and FSR balanced in on 4K, of course. Unless you want to lower the resolution, then you might be able to not use FSR or frame generation. In fact, that was the next thing that I tested was 4K Ultra Nightmare settings, but FSR set to balanced, and we always stayed over 60 and even mostly in the 70s. So it was a pretty smooth experience. So if you want to stay always above 60 and even the 70s, even FSR balanced is the way to go at 4K if you don't want to use frame generation, or if you want to use frame generation, then FSR quality and then frame generation. But anyways, that is going to be it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to hit that like button, leave a comment below, tell me what you think about Doom the Dark Ages and its performance, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because you want to be subscribed, and I'll see you next time.